So I'll start then. Good morning. Today is Monday, April 20th, 2020. I'm Barry Lind, Airport Director for the Manistee County Blacker Airport. The Manistee Blacker Airport Authority, April 20th, 2020 regular meeting is being conducted remotely, where all members of the Manistee County Blacker Airport Authority are in separate locations. The meeting will be called to order by Chair Jerry Haw shortly. This meeting is being recorded. In just a moment, we will start individually unmuting microphones. Actually, I've already done that, so I can skip that. The microphones of all members of the Manistee Blacker Airport Authority and myself will always be live unless there is an audio disruption. I will now be, don't need to do that. The Manistee County Blacker Airport Authority board members, please clearly state your name before making any motion or a second. And I request that all votes taken today by the board during this meeting shall be by roll call vote so that we clearly understand those for and against any motion. With that, I will turn the meeting over to our board chair, Mr. Haw, who can call the meeting to order.
Okay, with that, thank you, Barry. I'm going to go ahead and call the meeting to order. Julie, could we have a roll call?
Sure. Mr. Haw,
Yes.
Mr. Peterson,
Present.
Mr. Bergstrom,
Present.
Ms. Goodman, Ms. Goodman,
I know she was there.
I know. I don't know. She had her audio. I think her audio was turned off.
I'm here.
Okay.
Gotcha.
Mr. Dance, Mr. Suda, Mr. Suda.
I'm here, but they won't let me.
Oh, I hear you now. And Mr. Gentili.
Here.
Okay.
Excellent. We are ready to roll. Okay, I assume everybody's had a copy of the agenda. And unless there's some changes, I would ask for an approval of the agenda as approved.
Motion to approve the agenda, Bergstrom.
Second, Peterson.
Do you want a roll call on that too?
Yes, why don't we go ahead and do a roll call? It's probably going to be better in the long run. We get everything covered here. So go ahead and do a roll call, Julie.
Okay. Ms. Goodman?
Yes.
Ms. Goodman? Okay. Mr. Peterson?
Yes.
Mr. Gentili?
Yes.
Mr. Suda?
Yes.
Mr. Dance, absent. Mr. Bergstrom?
Yes.
And Mr. Haw?
Yes,
All right.
all said.
Yep.
Okay, moving on. Public comment, we're going to pass that because we don't have any public here at this point in time. Okay, moving on to approval of the minutes. I assume everybody's gotten a copy and I've had a chance to read the minutes from the previous March 16th meeting. Any comments, changes? If not, I'll ask for a roll call to approve as presented.
We'll need a motion first to approve them.
Also move, Mr. Peterson.
I'll second it.
Was that Mr. Haw?
Yes,
Okay. All right, I'll start the roll call.
okay,
Mr. Suda?
Yes.
Mr. Haw?
yes,
Mr. Bergstrom?
Yes.
Mr. Peterson?
Yes.
Ms. Goodman?
Yes.
And Mr. Gentili?
Yes.
All set.
okay, thank you. Moving on to treasurer's report. I presume everybody has gotten a copy and has a chance to review the March 2020 accounts payable report as presented to us by Susan.
Bergstrom, I'll make a motion to approve the accounts payable for March 2020.
Okay, I've just got one comment that I was going to put up there, and you can continue with that in a minute, Mark. Barry, I just noticed you had another breakout for cleaning hours.
That's not a new breakout. We've always had that.
Oh, I didn't see it last time. I did a quick check in the last couple. I didn't see it, so okay. I just thought it was kind of new with all this stuff where you're just trying to focus the cleaning hours.
Nope, we do all janitorial in-house, so that is a reflection of that.
Okay, my mistake then. Okay, Mark, you want to make that motion again to approve the March 2020 accounts payable?
Sure. Bergstrom, motion to approve the, accept, I should say, the March 2020 accounts payable.
Do I hear a second on that? If
I'll
not,
second that, Mr. Peterson.
okay. Julia, roll call, please.
Mr. Suda,
Yes.
Mr. Haw,
Yes.
Mr. Bergstrom. Mr. Bergstrom?
Yes.
Okay. Ms. Goodman?
You're
Ms.
muted.
Good.
Yes.
Mr. Peterson?
Yes.
And Mr. Gentili?
Yes.
Okay, sounds good. Moving on to the March 2020 financial statement, revenues and expenses, and the new addition that we have where it's called trial balance, trial balance sheet. Any comments? Everybody's got a copy of it, I hope, and has had a chance to review it.
Mhm.
Yeah, the only thing I've looked at and noticed is that, you know, for being 6 months into the year, we're not too far off budget. We're only 50,000 off. Not bad, considering everything, in my opinion.
Mhm. Mhm.
And I would add that that is, 50,000 is maybe not quite typical, but at this point of the year, that is typical that we would be a little bit behind budget because the winter months, we have less revenue than the summer months from things like fuel sales and landing fees and things like that. So that is part of that. And some of our bigger expenses, like our insurance payments, also come in the winter months in their annual payments. And those are roughly on the order of $20,000. So that's somewhat typical, but we'll see where things take us the remainder of the year.
Correct, correct. I just noticed that the other day. That's why I made that comment. But anyway, it really, it's tracking pretty good so far. So do I hear a motion to, go ahead.
Bergstrom, motion to accept the March 2020 revenue and expenses.
Do I hear a second on that?
I'll second it.
Okay, sounds good.
Goodman.
Julie, could we have a roll call, please?
Sure. Ms. Goodman,
Yes.
Mr. Gentili,
Yes.
Mr. Suda,
Yes.
Mr. Bergstrom,
Yes.
Mr. Peterson,
Yes.
Mr. Haw.
Yes. Okay, moving on to committee reports and discussions. I know there was no executive committee. There was no budget committee. and no capital projects committee since we last met in March. So moving on down further, I'm going to turn it over to Barry and let him go ahead and do his airport director's report. Did everybody get a copy of his outline?
I will be showing it on screen shortly.
Okay, okay. That'll work.
I'm hoping that people are seeing the things as I share them.
Yes.
Okay, I see
Yep.
him.
So I will start off with, so no accidents or incidents in the last month. It's not been a lot of activity. This next item is something that I sent out at least one email to the board last week talking about this. Under the Federal CARES Act, there was around $10 billion targeted at airports. And as a result of the formulas, interpretations of the formulas at play in that, we have currently been awarded $30,000 to be used for any lawful airport expense. Generally, these monies are anticipated to help operating expenses in a time of uncertainty. I've been on 2 calls this morning already talking about this, and if you saw some of the headline numbers that came out in the state's press release, our $30,000 is a small number compared to what other commercial air service airports in the state and across the country receive. We have fallen through the cracks in some sort of way that I'm still trying to figure out. But if we had 8,000 enplanements, we would have received about $620,000. And if we
Wow.
had 10,000 enplanements, we would have received about $1,050,000.
Holy smokes.
Unless we were an airport who had 0 debt, in which case we would have received $16 million.
Holy.
So for example, Alpena, which is an airport that has just over 10,000 enplanements, was awarded over $16 million because
Wow.
they have no debt. The formula, one aspect of the formula divides their assets by debt, and dividing something by 0 results in an error. And DOT, for the cases where there were errors, they just gave 25 points to that airport, which translates roughly into $15 million. So for example, there is an airport, Devil's Lake, North Dakota, which is, I don't know if there's in the 8,000 enplanements or 10,000 enplanements, but they're a small essential air service airport. They've got $16 million, which equates to 50 years worth of their operating expense.
Wow.
So
Yeah, unbelievable.
some of these issues are being noticed most on that end of the spectrum where airports were vastly awarded more than probably makes sense. Although now that you've published that and communicated that through press releases, it may be more difficult to claw back. But for whatever reason, we on the other end of the spectrum with roughly 5,000 enplanements essentially are getting the same amount as Ludington, Cadillac.
Frankfurt.
Frankfurt actually got a little bit less. They only got $20,000. The newspaper was wrong on that a little bit. The reason for that is in the list that DOT was using, we are not classified or categorized as a commercial service airport. We are classified as a basic general aviation airport. And I'm trying to figure out why that is. I suspect it may have something to do with the fact that we're a block grant state. So as a result, we're under the state's block grant, not individually under the FAA's jurisdiction. So I'm not sure that our correct status gets reported up. This impacts basically us and Ironwood in the UP, who both are under the block grant program. Normally, being under the block grant program means that we get $150,000 annually. And that's kind of what I would have expected in how these calculations came through, is that we would have gotten an amount equal to our annual allotment, that 150, which, as we know, is significantly less than the 1 million that a 10,000 employment airport gets. But it's more than zero, which is what we ended up getting. And because there were two numbers in the calculation. There was a number that was related to your annual allotment, and then a per passenger number that was added onto that. So we got basically zero in the one category. So I'm getting more information. I was really hoping Jeff would be on this call, because I know this is the type of thing that he likes to follow up with, but I will reach out to him after this meeting to kind of maybe start a dialogue. Again, from what I'm hearing in the industry, Congress is going to need to fix, or DOT is going to need to fix some of the issues that came out, and that opens up the opportunity that maybe we can improve our status and make it a little bit more comparable to other commercial air service airports.
Sounds a little bit politicking to me.
Correct. Yeah, Barry, definitely reach out to Jeff and maybe make a call to our congressman up north there again.
Yep.
And see what can go on, because it sounds, what you just reported, it sounds quite unfair and very lopsided.
All things considered, 30,000 is more than zero, so I'm happy for that. But it's the disparity for between commercial air service airports and vast disparity that's not really making sense right now.
Correct.
There should be parity instead of disparity.
There you go.
So,
Yes.
anyone have any questions on that?
Well, Barry, we can use this grant for payroll from what I saw over here.
We can use it for any lawful airport expense. So we could use it for really anything.
Yeah, for like construction, T-hangers, repairs, et cetera, and so on, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Well, 30,000 is nice, but it does certainly sound like politicking to me.
It sounds very, very low. It sounds like we got the raw end of the stick.
Yeah. Well, I was born and raised in North Dakota, and I know where Devil's Lake is, and it's like a little, about a couple hundred people, I think. So I would guess that there's a little politicking going on, because that's very much a Republican state. But
Wow.
hey.
In that sense, I don't think it's politicking. I think it's an honest mistake that was made. And in trying to get this money awarded and out there quickly. And, but now that it's been published and these noticed, the question is how it's going to be addressed.
Okay.
I will move on to our airfares. I'm not really sure how relevant any of this information is right now, but airfares have gone up about 15% in the last month. I don't think anyone's really purchasing many of these right now. I think a month ago we were kind of just before all the significant shutdowns were occurring. I think airlines were trying to stimulate demand by offering very, very low fares. And I think what we see now is the realization that there isn't an accumulate, and that if people need to fly, they will pay more reasonable fares. And therefore, I think we'll see fares kind of come back to more of a normal level as things start to open up during the course of the summer. So I think that's what we're seeing here. It's interesting noting that the fares out of Traverse City and Grand Rapids are pretty much equal. Grand Rapids is only $8 less expensive on average. Muskegon is significantly higher. They are the highest. And I think the reason for that just gets into how United prices its essential air service markets. It's kind of how that is showing up there. Any questions on airfares? I don't think we need to spend much time on it, but if someone has a question, I'd be willing to entertain it.
Hey, Barry, this is Andrew. I had a trip scheduled this past weekend that I had to rebook until the end of the month.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know if this is just a one-off with Southwest, but when they rebooked it, it rebooked for half the cost of my original fare.
That doesn't surprise me. When did you book your original fare?
Back in late February, and then when it came clear that it was the lockdown was being extended, I kicked it out to the end of this month, and it went from like $320 down to $160.
Yeah, I would believe that. You know, there are still many markets that have very significantly low fares, but it's not as low as it was a month ago. Okay. Here's, well, in some ways, these numbers are still somewhat respectable. In March, we had 108 total passengers, which is abysmal compared to where we were a year, 2 years ago with around 600, 500 to 600. But that's no longer attributed to our performance issues with the airline. It's now attributed to basically a complete lack of demand and or really, I don't want to say lack of demand. I mean, people are actively being encouraged not to travel. So therefore, you know, it's for a lot of reasons, things have gone down. But, you know, come April, our April number will be much, much less than that. And I'll talk about that in, well, I guess I can talk about it here. So today is the 20th of the month. So far this month, we have had a total of 7 passengers, averaging about 2 passengers a week. And that, I think, is what we will continue to see until people are really allowed to travel for anything other than essential/emergency need. I think my next slide talks about this a little bit more. As it relates,
Barry,
go ahead, Mark.
Barry, I have a question. Now that obviously COVID-19 is making a big impact, so will we be seeing additional federal funds in order to keep the airport running? And I know that you talked about a program earlier that we get some money, but I'm wondering if they're going to be subsidizing the airports even more now. Is that possible or what?
I am not aware of any planned federal programs that would further aid us, other than Essential Air Service, which we are already being aided by, and then the CARES Act airport revenues. So there's nothing else that would be applicable to us in the pipeline that I'm aware of. That doesn't mean, I mean, it's a fluid environment, so things can change, but as of now, I would say no.
Okay.
Okay. And if I heard correctly, you said you're projecting like 4 to 8 passengers down the road now, or not?
For the rest of the month.
For the month of April, I mean, we've had 7 so far. We currently have another 9 currently booked for the rest of the month. So we could end up in the order of 15 or so. But what I'm seeing is, as these people that are booked in advance, as the day of their travel comes, they cancel unless there's, they're kind of hanging on, hoping that things will open up a little bit more, or allow them to travel. But since that's not yet happening this month, that 9 remaining for the rest of the month probably is optimistic.
But the airline's still flying because they're being subsidized, right?
My next slide, I will be talking about that. So yes,
Okay.
we are essentially still flying. And what we are experiencing is no different than the rest of the country or the rest of the world. Numbers I'm seeing is that nationally, as reported by TSA, passenger boardings are down 96%. So about 4% of what numbers were a year ago. We're a little bit less than that, but I think the nature of our travel tends to be less essential, less critical than some other routes, and therefore we're even more disproportionately impacted. But there are empty flights flying all over the country. Any questions on this? I do want to talk about the second set of numbers here, the performance. So in March, we still did, as public charters was switching from their piecemeal approach to providing service, using jet on a daily basis. There were a couple days where they ended up canceling flights because they had no one to operate. So we still see a 10% cancel rate. But from a delay perspective,
Right on time.
and very good. Now, it's sometimes hard to measure what a delay is right now because of how they're flying, but I'll talk about that in a second. So just in general, what are the impacts of the pandemic on us, on Manistee County Black Earth Airport? In the last 3 weeks, I've been on 2 different conference calls. One was a conference call for all essential air service airports in the country, as well as all air carriers who serve them. And the other one was for all airports in the country. And in both of those conference calls, the Secretary of Transportation, Elaine Chao, basically gave a very similar opening remarks, and really stressing the government's view that airports and air transportation are essential to the well-being of this country, and they're doing everything possible so that the air transportation system remains open and viable. They're focusing a lot on freight and movement of goods, but as well movement of people. And particularly in the essential air service call, it was stated that their intention is that every flight that is currently subsidized for essential air service, they want it to operate, because that's generating fuel sales. All of the trickle down dollars from that activity are still flowing through the economy, as opposed to, oh, we don't have any passengers today, we're not going to fly the flight. Now, as it relates to us in the alternate essential air service program, the standard essential air service airports, so not us, they have language in their agreements that, and DOT has the flexibility for, if a flight can't be operated for reasons beyond the air carrier's control, that DOT will still pay 1/2 of the normal subsidy. So that gives those air carriers in standard markets the option of not flying on days where they have no passengers, but still receiving a reduced subsidy to cover kind of fixed expenses that are there regardless of whether they're operating a specific flight. So obviously you don't have fuel and you don't have wear and tear in the aircraft, but you're still going to have lease payments and things like that out there.
Do we qualify too, Barry?
No. So I had asked before that call, there was an opportunity to submit questions, and I had asked the question, does that rule apply to alternate essential air service airports? And the answer was no, because we are guided by the explicit terms of our grant agreement. And our grant agreement does not have that language in it. DOT said that they were going to review with their legal counterparts whether or not they would allow grant amendments to allow that type of scenario. I haven't yet heard anything from them. I suspect I'm going to need to prod them because I suspect they're working on a lot of things right now, and that may not be, it just may have gotten lost in the shuffle. So what that means is for public charters and us to get any subsidy dollars, we have to be flying our routes on basically a scheduled basis. So what the airline is doing is they are trying to save as much dollars as possible while still following that guidance. So let's take an example like today where we have no passengers scheduled. Our original schedule would say that the aircraft would depart here at 8:30 and return at 7 p.m. tonight. Fly down to Chicago, wait all day, come back. We know that we're going to have no passengers, or someone could book a flight today to want to come in this evening. So what the airline is doing is they're basically not flying at 8:30 in the morning, waiting until middle of the afternoon, confirming that there are still no passengers, departing here, flying about halfway down to Chicago, radioing into Chicago, double checking that there are still no passengers, that they need to land there. They then turn around and come back empty. So they are still flying. If passengers were there, they would be providing the service expected. But by not landing in Chicago, they don't have landing fees. They've got less fuel burn because they're not going all the way down there. They're not needing to pay ground handling down there, or their contract actually says that they pay a quarter of the regular rate if a flight is not needed. So public charters is saving dollars by operating in this way, but yet still having published flights and a takeoff and landing each day. So kind of wanted to convey what our activity currently is, in case someone asks how we're doing things.
What a scenario.
It is. General aviation activity is noticeably reduced, although, this time of year we still are kind of coming out of our winter slumber. So there's not a lot of activity on a normal year. There is less, but we did have a private jet come in last night, pick someone up. So we are still operating as an airport and providing the services we provide to those that need it. I already mentioned that the airline is doing daily operations. As it relates to staffing, I've adjusted everyone's schedules here such that we're minimizing any contact between employees. and minimizing the number of people that reside in the terminal at any given time. So typically our schedule has traditionally been is that there's a morning shift and an afternoon shift, and there are basically 2 people on during a given week. That's now changed such that one person is basically working at 7 consecutive 12-hour days, and then basically they've got the next 2 weeks basically off, and we're rotating people in for 7-day shifts. So that so there's basically no interaction at all between 2 people and the person who's here on a given week. In the office, myself and Gail, who helps me out here, are alternating days in the office, and then the other is working from home on the alternating days. And on the airline side, they've divided up into 2 crews, and basically they alternate, or they're never in at the same time. So there are always people around who are not around should an incident occur where virus could be spread to those in the building.
So Barry, everybody's still employed though, right?
Yes. The only, on the airline side, because of the fact that they're basically doing instead of doing a morning and an evening, kind of combining it into on days there are no passengers, combining it into just an afternoon round trip, their hours are less than they would otherwise be, but everybody is getting hours, so yes.
Good. Good.
Are we still covered under that system if somebody had an accident on the runway?
Yep, we are meeting all of our obligations as to requirements for whether it be firefighting, etc.
Barry, I don't know if I missed this in last month's meeting when I was out of town, but where do we stand with the TSA agreement?
Because we are now flying again with need for TSA, from all perspectives, that is no longer an issue. However, we don't have any it is interesting that I mentioned there are 7 passengers so far this month. I think only one of those was an outbound passenger requiring TSA. Pretty much what we're seeing is people returning from winter, basically snowbirds returning, and to their basically home for the summer. So we generally are only seeing people come in. So there's really nothing for TSA to do pretty much every day. So they are occasionally here, but the demand for TSA services in Traverse City is like 10% of what it was before. So they're, I think, technically working from home, but they're still being paid to the extent that I know.
Okay.
Did that answer your question, Andrew?
Yeah, I just wanted to make sure I didn't miss anything and the timeline didn't expire, because I know you said there was a strict timeline on that.
Nope, it did not. We got back to flying, and that was basically most of the month of March. TSA.
Is that good for the future, or is it just going to be another month or 2, or what?
I can't say how TSA and the federal government is going to look at some of these scenarios where they're basically keeping people on the payroll even though there's no work for them to do. I think given what the federal government has been doing to protect the economy, I think it's unlikely in the short to midterm that they would do things to be laying off lots of people. But that, again, everything is fluid. Things can change.
Mm-hmm. I have a general question for you too. It's like take a Chicago. You know, what kind of passengers are really flying out of Chicago right now? Is it like 20% of what normal, or 50%, or I'm just kind of general. If you know, I'd be interested to know if, how much it's reduced.
Nationwide, it's 4%.
4%.
4%.
Wow.
Yeah.
Thank
Quite a
you.
significant reduction.
Yes. I mean, if it weren't for what the federal government has done so far to keep planes flying, there probably would not be any commercial air service in this country.
Wow.
No fun
Holy smokes.
to be flying large planes with 2 or 3 people on them.
Yeah, that makes sense.
But once you shut that down, the consequences of that have significant implications longer term. So,
No, that's how I was talking to my son the other day, who's a pilot for Northwest or Southwest Airlines, and he's still flying. And I said, how many people are in the plane at times and so on? He says, I had a flight the other day with 10 people on the plane that normally carries 140 people.
Wow.
So,
Yeah.
yeah.
other things, as you can probably expect, we're doing enhanced cleaning and sanitation of our public spaces. The good news as of right now, the environment has had a minimal impact on our finances. Both revenue and expenses haven't been impacted significantly. On the revenue side, most of our revenue either comes from the county or from fees to the airline, and to date, those have not been impacted. Where there may be a slight impact is on things like our fuel flow fees, the 15 cents a gallon that the airport gets, or landing fees. But again, where we are in the course of the year, we have minimal amounts of those anyway. So really, at this point, we don't have much financial impact on the airport. That can obviously change. There will be certainly more impact in the summer. I'm not anticipating that we're going to see nearly as much general aviation traffic, not as much landing fees, not as much fuel sales as we would historically. But again, that doesn't impact us significantly because it's not a huge source of revenue. Where we could run into issues is if is some sort of insolvency, either by Ultimate Jet or by public charters as a result of this. I'm going to give you 2 examples of things on that front. So Ultimate Jet, who operates aircraft that we have here, they've got about 10 of those aircraft and have had a fairly significant route servicing, kind of the eastern half of the United States into generally business markets. The only aircraft that they own that is still operating is ours. They have shut down completely everything else. So they're getting 0 revenue. Obviously, they've eliminated their some of their operating expenses, but a lot of their fixed expenses still exist, whether it be lease payments, et cetera. So depending on how federal funding applies to them, doesn't apply to them, it's, not, you could imagine a scenario where they are no longer solvent quickly in this environment. And if we don't have someone to operate planes, even if public charters is getting subsidy money to pay money, as we know, there aren't a lot of options for public charters to use to provide the service we have. 2, public charters itself, while we are a part of their business, they are also in the home airport that they're based at in, I can't think of the airport name in Pennsylvania right now. They're the primary fixed-based operator on the field. A lot of their revenue comes from fuel sales to traffic at that airport. They run a maintenance shop and all of those things. They're not seeing any revenue in those areas. So while our aspect of their business maybe is fine, it could be other parts of their business that are now completely not fine that could provide problem in the next couple of months. And if, you know, some of those things happen, $20,000 a month in revenue that could go away, and that would financial situation in a different light if that were to happen. Fortunately, with the EAS contract and bidding process, you know, now that we're in the middle of that, there is potentially light at the end of that tunnel. It's not necessarily that these things, you know, issues with public charters or Ultimate Jet would necessarily be long-term impacts, but they may be, they could be significant short-term financial impacts. Any questions on any of that? Just kind of a wide-ranging set of information about what we're doing, kind of the current state of affairs. Hearing none, I will move on.
Yes, move on. That was a lot of stuff to digest. Thanks, Barry.
So a lot of these are things that not necessarily a lot of new information. Are PFAS. So you'll have seen in our financials that we've been invoiced and we've received the equipment for that testing, the testing equipment for our firefighting foam. There's still about $6,000 left to be invoiced to us, and we're waiting on a state grant to fund that. I've been told that it will be funded. It was being held up because the Aeronautics Commission wasn't having its meeting because of basically the inability to gather together. I don't know if they ended up having an online virtual meeting or not to get those grants approved, but that's kind of where that stands. I mentioned this last month that as part of the state budget for the current fiscal year, there's been an award for about $4 million to do environmental studies on all airports that have potential foam PFAS contamination. We've been contacted by Eagle. They're starting the process of gathering survey information from us to conduct that. It's still unclear as to how those contracts to do these projects will get awarded, who the grant recipients will be, whether it'll be MDOT, whether it'll be directly to the airport, whether it'll be through Eagle itself. A lot of that program is still being sorted out, but there will be a fairly significant environmental study conducted probably in the next 12 months, basically looking at our potential exposure issues to the long-term use of that product on the airport. Now, having said that, we've only ever used it for training purposes and for annual testing of the product. So there's not been significant releases into the environment. Some, and unfortunately, our soil conditions being sandy don't trap the PFAS. They allow it to basically spin, and therefore we'll see where that all leads us. So last year, the state awarded $400,000 to basically provide the testing equipment so that we no longer need to disperse it into the environment. This year, they budgeted $4 million to basically do these environmental studies. At conference, we were joking, so does that mean next year they're going to budget $40 million to do cleanup? Or they'll say, oh, nope, that's the airport's responsibility. We'll see where this all goes.
Barry, one question I was looking through my notes and so on. The FAA's equipment has been installed and so on for testing.
Yep.
And my question is, who are you guys able to conduct the testing or use this equipment?
Yep.
Or
And that $6,000 that's remaining was the fee for the training.
okay, okay. So you can do it on site here. You don't have to have somebody standing by all the time for that. Good. Okay, that was my question.
Then I'm kind of the fuel system monitor, which is still not working. I've kind of been holding off on that just to get a better understanding of our financial situation. Probably not going to be able to hold off on that anymore. And also it was winter, so it was not something that was likely to schedule to be implemented during the middle of winter. But that likely is going to be changing soon as I get back to focusing on that. We, as Part 139 airports, are required to every May do recurrent training for our firefighters. Well, actually, I'm skipping over the first one. Let me go back. So, triennial exercise. So, as a Part 139 airport, as a Class 1 Part 139 airport, we've been required to do every 3 years an emergency exercise. Our due date for that is the end of May this year. At the planning meeting we had a while ago, our county emergency manager requested that we ask for an extension. That's been granted. We're now planning on doing that in September. And, we'll see if that is even reasonable. I'm hoping it is. The ARF training, the recurrent training, is a every year thing. We're still scheduled for May 9th to be doing that. Again, we are technically obligated to have that training done by the end of May. And,
Barry, does the state pick up the cost on that training?
the state gives us $2,000 a year as a grant to cover that. On years where I send people generally over to Saginaw to do training there, that $2,000 covers the expense. But this year, we're bringing actually the mobile trainer here. I like to do that in this case, every 3 years, just so you're working with your own equipment as opposed to sitting into somebody else's fire truck that you've really got no experience with. And also when we do it here, we have the opportunity to invite basically the partnering fire departments, Manistee Township, the city, East Lake, so that their firefighters also get some of this training. So we don't do that every year because it's roughly a $6,000 to $7,000 expense, and we get offset by $2,000. We kind of are on every 3 years we incur that due on site, and then the other years we send the minimum number of people elsewhere, and then that gets fully covered.
So the host really picks up the cost, I guess, huh?
Yep.
That's still on for the 9th?
It is current. I've talked to them recently, and they're still planning on being here. I can imagine scenarios where that won't happen on the 9th, but I think given the nature of the requirements, given the nature of the activity, there are safe ways we can conduct it that will fall within existing regulations at that time.
What's the time on that? During the day, what time?
I suspect it will start either 8 or 9 for classroom instruction, and then probably around noon there would be the outside live fire portion of it. Okay. Land acquisition. I have sitting on my desk here the final paperwork that I need to work with Susan on to get Mr. Adamczyk his final check. He came in last week asking about that. I said I'd get it wrapped up in the next 2 weeks, intending to get it done last week. It's got to happen this week, so that can get completed. And then we can submit, also working with Susan on this, for the second grant amendment to capture the legal expenses that we have on that project, and then really get that all closed out. And then we still have this outstanding amount that we're ultimately eligible for reimbursement on at some point in the future, probably later this year when we are processing payments under our project this year, our ALP update. Go ahead, Mark.
So the feds are going to pick that up then?
Yes, yes.
Okay, that was my question. Thank you.
Some things, projects like, last fall when we were fretting about how our runway wasn't getting resurfaced, and that seemed significant. And now 6 months later, it's like, oh yeah, we still got a capital plan project to do.
Right.
This is still on. I am meeting with Reith Riley on Wednesday. They're coming out. We're going to walk the job site and just make sure that they're comfortable with things or discover any last minute issues. But that is still on track for May 26th through June 5th, a 10-day project window to do that work. Airline flights are not scheduled on those days, and I think that that's going to happen. But again,
In ideal time for it to happen.
some ways it is, yes.
Yeah.
Might lose 4 or 5 passengers.
What?
I said we might lose 4 or 5 passengers.
Well, I guess we'll take that. Well, they already know we're not flying at that time, so we're already scheduled out for that time anyway.
No update on wildlife survey. Something else sitting on my desk that needs to get moved forward. Last month, the board approved this independent fee estimate agreement with Mead and Hunt. They are in the midst of doing that. I anticipate they'll wrap that up this week, which will allow Priya Newhoff to continue progress on the airport layout plan update.
Okay, good.
Some of this I've already covered in talking earlier about kind of status of things. But yes, jet and public charters are working daily with the Bernier jet. The Beach 1900, we haven't talked about that yet today. In some way, the priority is lower because Ultimate Jet doesn't have anything to do with its jets other than Manistee, because it's the only route they have going. Everything that was holding up the Beach 1900 from operating is now completed, with the one exception is there needs to be an FAA check ride, which is basically an examiner sitting in the cockpit with the crew, basically checking their competency. It's kind of a final check. The FAA is not currently doing any in-person activities of this sort. So until the FAA stops or changes that policy and starts doing these things, that is just on hold until it's.
So, Barry, out of curiosity, where would that happen? Over in Pennsylvania with wherever that plane is sitting right now, I guess?
It probably would actually happen on our route.
Okay.
intention is that the FAA would want to kind of see them working in the airspace of Chicago, which is, where they would be operating on a regular basis. So
Okay,
looking at some of those things.
just out of curiosity, that's all.
Good news, I guess. The summer schedule is open. Actually, booking is available through the end of Public Charter's contract of September 30th. So if people were so inclined, they could book right now for 4th of July and all of those things. They're not. Even farther out. Normally this time of year, we'd be seeing 100 to 150, maybe even to 200 seats being sold a week. Last week we saw 3. Part of that is, I think, an out of sight, out of mind. People aren't even thinking about summer or travel this summer, not knowing what that's going to look like. Part of it is, I don't think people even realize that we're still operating because I think they just assume everything shut down, even though, again, airports are considered essential services, so we are still operating somewhat normally. And I think actually I'm going to jump ahead to the last marketing. We're talking on marketing of this is we don't want to come across from a marketing standpoint as being callous and not caring and basically say, hey, book your travel now. We're still operating, ignore the governor's travel restrictions and fly out of Manistee. Doesn't quite sound right. But at the same time, we would like to get word out there that if you're looking for August or September, you can book now and, get the lowest fares because those first few seats are the ones that have the lowest fares. So we haven't yet figured out a way of communicating to our customer base where things are, because we're really concerned about coming across and really sounding callous, and we don't want to do that. So we're erring on the side of basically being more quiet than maybe we should be. But that's kind of a marketing tie-in to the fact that the summer schedule is open. Because normally when we open the summer schedule, we have a big advertising push that basically lets everyone know they can book for summer now. The rest of my slides basically get into the essential service selection process, which happens to be another item on the agenda. I don't know, Jerry, if you want me to talk about it now, if you want to get to that point in the agenda, and then I'll bring up these next 3 slides and we can talk about the details then.
Why don't you bring them up in a few minutes here?
Okay. Then I will stop talking now unless there are any questions.
Right. So anyway, let's move on to old business, unfinished business. If not, then we'll give the chair back to Barry for his new business.
I have a question.
Yes, go ahead.
I have a question if there's any status or any change of status or update to the Ted Aaron hangar deal that was proposed.
I didn't catch that.
I said if there's any change of status or an update to the Ted Aaron's hangar that he was in the market to gift to us.
I can address that.
Go ahead. I think I know the answer to that, but go ahead.
So, as you're aware, in the winter when Public Charters was looking for a hangar to basically park the Beech 1900 during the winter, there was a negotiation going on, and Mr. Aarons had offered to basically essentially end the lease and turn over his hangar to the airport in exchange for us taking on the responsibility of fixing the door on it, which was discovered during the course of this process, has some structural issues. That need obviously has gone away since it's no longer winter and the 1900 never actually got here. However, that offer of Mr. Aaron's still is outstanding. In fact, he reached out to me a week or so ago, just wanting to know where we were with that. So nothing has moved forward at this time. Now, tying this into a couple other things is one of the EAS bids, the one from Air Choice 1, you'll notice that or you may or may not notice that the aircraft they're proposing is a Beech 1900. Sounds familiar. They reached out to me as part of their due diligence of preparing their bid and asked if we had a hangar available for them. And I said, well, not really, but maybe. What I discussed with them is roughly on my part of it would take probably $100,000 to basically retrofit that hangar in a way that would be usable for what they want to use it for. Public charters was really going to kind of go because they only needed it for a short period of time. It so that they could use it, even though the entire aircraft wouldn't fit inside. Air Choice 1 really wants to modify the hangar such that they can actually fit the plane in there and close the door. So that's kind of where that $100,000 number came from. So they have included in their financial calculation essentially a payment to us of roughly $4,300 a month over the 24 months of their contract, be $100,000 for us to basically provide them that hangar and do the modifications. So if out of this EAS selection process, that is a direction we go, that will basically push us down the path of working with Mr. Ahrens and taking him up on his offer. None of the other bidders have requested hangar space and or the ability to house their aircraft. And even if they did, their aircraft are much smaller, in which case they would fit potentially in other locations or not require as significant of a change in that hangar. So that's a piece of this. Another piece of this is looking at our financial situation where our general fund balance is basically at zero, and a lot of financial uncertainty. I've not thought it prudent to move forward in trying to acquire Mr. Ahrens' hangar, because one thing that would do immediately is it would reduce or eliminate about $2,500 a year in revenue that we're currently getting from Mr. Ahrens on land lease for that. It would also, for us to use that hangar, we would have to expend dollars to address the door issue. Now, doing those things open up opportunities for other revenues. So you could make a case either way on that. But I have not moved that forward until for those reasons. So did that answer your question, Phil?
Well, yeah, I guess. I think though, the longer we wait, if it gets right down to the, let's say, July or whatever, and the concern that you had mentioned does in fact want the hangar, how long is it going to take to draw up the lease deal or the purchase deal with the airport lawyer? It doesn't seem as though he's a he's a real speedy sort of guy, and in all possibility, none of them really are.
Right.
So, I just don't want to see something like it be at the last minute and then, well, we forgot to do this, or something like that. So if it was, perhaps if maybe the lawyer was contacted and said, well, here's a proposal that we want, and can you somewhat prepare this ahead of time without expending a whole lot of money into it? That's what, can we get something started so that if in fact we do want to do something with it, we can hit the ground running?
So my thoughts on that would be, and we haven't yet talked about this, this is the agenda item coming up, but assuming we have a special meeting a week from today, if out of that meeting, Air Choice 1 was our preference, basically that means move full speed ahead to work with Ted and get that process going so that it can be accomplished by the end of the year. If the board chooses a different carrier, that doesn't then have that immediate need to move forward. But I think based on our conversation earlier, Phil, that in your opinion, you would still recommend that we move forward with this sooner rather than later, so that we control this asset, hoping to get revenues and figuring out how then we're going to deal with any expenses that we may incur.
Well, it does seem like a real nice opportunity because we would have funds coming in to make the payments on the improvements to that hangar of Aaron's, Mr. Ted Aaron's. So it does look like it's worth taking a pretty serious look at.
Yeah, I agree with that, but I think also we got to keep in mind the airport lawyer is probably pretty well tuned into some of this stuff because of the work we've had him done. He's been doing for us in the last several months. So I think he's kind of up to speed, and it won't take him that long to pull things together anymore like it did before.
But that's just the first step. Then
Right, right.
the contractor, finding someone qualified and able to give us guidance on how to repair it, and all of those things. And all of those things can take time.
Right, and what Phil's suggesting is something to keep in mind, definitely.
And again,
Well, it does look like it would provide an opportunity to have a source for the improvements done. So, yeah, it just seems like it has a little bit of an opportunity.
Correct. Go ahead, Barry.
I was just gonna say, I mean, I'm open to direction on this. It has not been a priority based on the needs for it are no longer there. But that doesn't mean that there's not an opportunity that you could request that I pursue in a more aggressive manner than I have been.
I would suggest that we go through our bid evaluation process and see where everything sets. We're only talking like a week or so out from now, right?
Yep.
Yeah, so I would suggest we just kind of hold and do our bid evaluations and see where we go from there before we jump on the next.
And it's entirely possible that, and again, I mentioned that the other carriers who have smaller aircraft haven't requested hangar space,
But they may.
but they may just assume that it exists and may come back and say, oh, well, we need a hangar, where can we park? And it's like, well, could you pay us enough to pay for a door? In which case, we've got a place for you.
Okay.
I thought I heard that, Barry, that it would be, if they needed this hangar and it was usable, they'd pay $4,300 a month, which generates, I think, about $51,000 over that period of, say, a year. That would be maybe another year, and we've got the improvements for that completely covered. And I'm not saying that this is the cat's meow, but I think Mr. Suda has kind of raised a good point there.
Yep. And I agree with all these comments. I will, though, also agree with what Mr. Haas said, is knowing who we've selected, and I'll get into some of the details of how I think who we select will ultimately be, who our carrier will be. We can then work with them and understand what their needs are and whether or not there's opportunity for them to be funding any sort of improvements, which gives us then a little more clarity as to how to pay for these things.
He is here, so I
I would have to agree that probably within a week, we'll have more information and be able to make more of a educated decision on this.
Correct. Okay, Barry, continue.
You were kind of asking, I think, old business items, so. And Phil brought that up. I'm not sure if there are any other things.
Oh, okay, okay. Well, I thought we were in the new business now.
If that's where you are, then that's where I can go.
Okay, anybody else have any old business? Clarify and make sure we're not skipping somebody on old unfinished business. Okay, Barry, continue on the ESA bid evaluation process.
I will, as soon as I can switch around screen sharing back to my presentation. Okay, so a week ago today, and that is after 2 extensions requested by different carriers in the bid due date. The first extension took it, I think, from the 18th of March to the end of March, and then the second extension took it from the end of March to April 13th. That second extension was requested by SkyWest. They, at the last minute, were given basically a go-ahead from their management to do essential air service bids in the midst of the uncertainty. I think because that's guaranteed revenue, whereas in aviation right now, there's very little that's guaranteed. But at the end, they decided not to bid, and I forwarded to the board their email, but the predominant reason was the fact that United was not going to basically code share with them on this route. United's concern was that it's too close to Traverse City and it might impact their presence there. So that eliminated what in some ways would be a very desirable option, especially for our summer months with the regional jet operating under SkyWest. During the bidding process, there were 6 carriers that had at one time or another indicated to me they were planning on bidding. I think going through 2 sets of extensions, I think that eliminated one of the carriers. Silver was the other one that decided not to bid. And I just think that it just stopped making sense the more they started thinking about the environment and how things are evolving. However, we did get 4 bids, and I think they're actually 4 very strong bids. They're all 9-seat aircraft, so that will be an adjustment for us. But many of the other factors that we look for, I think all of these carriers can cover some aspect of those factors in different degrees to different levels. I think any of them would be a marked improvement over where we have been the last year, year and a half in our service. And I think it's going to be an interesting process. The other thing that really surprised me is that basically all 4 bids were pretty much identical from a dollar subsidy perspective, around $3.6 million a year, which surprised me because usually there's some wide variability in that. And that is a factor that DOT considers. So for example, if you had bids that came in at 3, 3.5, 4, and 5, kind of a wide range like that. If the community of the airport said, oh, we really love that 5 million, and probably reasons it would be desirable, DOT would generally look at that and say, well, that's $2 million more. That's 40% more. Sorry, you're not going to get your choice. You're going to go something that's a little more cost effective. But because all 4 of these basically are at the same time, and most of the other criteria that DOT looks at can be checked off, it really will boil down to, I believe, what our desire is will most likely result in that being the carrier that we get through this process. So, having said that, next steps. I had sent an email a while ago just requesting availability for a special board meeting a week from today. At that time, I was thinking we would have 6 presentations, and Jerry got back to me and said that he was concerned trying to squeeze in presentations in an afternoon was probably not going to happen, that I should start looking at multiple days. But now that we only have 4, I think we're back to being able to do that in a long afternoon meeting, much like this. Does the 27th still work for everybody? I'm thinking starting at noon, first presentation starting at 12:30, and then basically doing 12:30, 1:30, 2:30, 3:30, and then discussion afterwards. Either we can make a decision at that point, or we can digest that information and figure out another day to make a final decision. We have until sometime in May, and I forget the exact date. I meant to look it up before this meeting so I could do that. It's in the email from DOT that I think I actually forwarded on to the board on that. So we have a little time. Generally, they give about a month for communities to come back. I have reached out to all 4 carriers, and all 4 are available to do presentations on the 27th.
Okay, that's good. I was just going to ask you whether they're all available.
They are. So
For me anyway, next Monday on the time you proposed is fine for me. I don't know the rest of the board. Say yes or no on that.
I'm still fine too.
The 27th, what day does that fall on? I don't have a calendar.
That's
right
Monday,
in front of me
Mark.
here.
That's a Monday, Mark.
a
A
week,
week from today.
Okay,
Right.
all right. Monday. And you're looking at starting in the morning or the afternoon or what?
noon.
All
Noon.
day?
Noon,
All afternoon.
starting at noon.
Afternoon, okay.
Probably 5 hours, Mark.
Afternoon, 5 hours, okay.
Right. It'll be a long afternoon.
Uh-huh, yeah, well, it's important.
Yes, it's important. I think we ought to hack it out so that if we have any comments or concerns and so on, we'll still have some time to get those worked out before we have to do our final choice.
Do you want me to
And
run
again-
down a roll call to see if everybody's available so everybody's not just yelling yes?
Yes, I think that's a very good idea. Thanks, Julie. Go ahead and do a roll call.
All right, I'm doing a roll call right now to see if Monday, April 27th at noon, blocking off probably from noon until 5 is going to work for everybody. So Mr. Haw,
Yes.
Mr. Peterson,
Yes.
Mr. Bergstrom,
Yes,
Miss Goodman. Miss Goodman?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Mr. Suda,
Yes.
And Mr. Gentili.
I could be available till 2:30. I have a meeting at 2:30, and then once that's over, I could jump back on.
Okay, that's better than nothing. That's good.
And
Okay.
Jeff indicated when I originally asked that he would be available. That may have changed, but
I can confirm with
I-
him after this meeting if you want, but if he's not available, do you still want to do it?
Yes, I think we do. There's
Okay.
enough of us to make a decision, and we can always fill Jeff in
Okay.
piecemeal down the road.
Okay. So I'll go ahead and I'll post it then also after this meeting.
Yes.
okay. We'll then time slots with each of the four and put together that agenda.
Sounds good, Barry.
Okay, I have a question, Barry. Are you going to like put a little structure together first, a little table of some sort with the?
Yep, you're jumping ahead. That's where I was going to go next.
Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead. Go ahead.
Unfortunately, since you're just on the phone, it's not something I sent out. It is something I will show on the screen, but I will send it out after this meeting.
Thank you.
So the rest of the process is that once we come up with our recommendation, I'll be looking to solicit community support letters for our choice. The DOT typically takes 60 to 90 days to make a final selection. And, that kind of gives us a timeline of, middle of summer and then, working towards that October 1st start date. If, things go south with our current carriers, we have the, opportunity of trying to basically speed this up. DOT can prioritize these decisions sooner. And I think new carriers probably at this point in time would be in a position to start earlier than October 1st. So I think there's some, leeway on that October 1st date. But, short of insolvency on our existing carrier or some other contract issue, we're kind of looking at a timeline that takes us to October 1st.
Barry, will you be basically putting together an outline then, and then you'll be sending that to us electronically and printed, and we're going to work under similar situation like today. Is that correct?
Yep. So we should
Okay.
that the meeting next week will be this format, obviously with each carrier joining at their allotted time, and doing their presentation online. I have, as Mark was kind of asking just a second ago, 2 years ago when we did this, myself and our marketing expert, Brandon Jensen, worked together and kind of put together an evaluation form. He and I met a couple times last week and have put together a new version of that for us to use this time. And I will switch over to showing that. Okay, you should now be seeing this. So back in November, I had asked the board what their priorities were for a new carrier. And at that time, the board identified 5 priorities and ranked them in the following order: reliability, schedule, interline/baggage agreements, pricing, and then the type of aircraft. And you'll see those are the top 5 in order on this review criteria. The way that this form works is basically requesting that we collectively or individually, however we kind of come up with a rank, rate each character on a scale of 0 to 5 in these categories. The categories are weighted such that the most important gives you more ultimate points than the less important. And that's that weighting factor that we're seeing. In addition, Brandon and I felt that there are other factors that should be considered. We've given them all smaller weightings in this, but we've added another 6 to the that is capacity to handle our seasonal demand and anticipated growth. That growth factor is, I think, more challenging now than ever to think about, because in some ways maybe we'll just be happy to get back to where we were over the course of the next 2 years. But, you know, so maybe that growth piece is overly optimistic, but we still do have seasonal demand, and we'll still have seasonal demand regardless of what level that ultimate demand is. The user booking process and experience, this is a shortcoming that Public Charters has had since they started here 8 years ago, is they really had no way of booking through a mobile device, which is really what the world now routinely does. Is, you know, everything is moved to mobile devices for interacting with businesses, and we just never had that. So we think that that's important as to what that booking process is. How they support via marketing their service. Brandon and I have already met with 2 of the carriers and talked with their marketing departments on how they approach marketing, how they work collaboratively with the communities. So we've got a good understanding of 2 of the 4 already. We'll probably be trying to get more information from the remaining ones. This last one may or may not be important, but it's what hub they fly into. Since all the bids are to Chicago O'Hare, there's really no variety there. But an aspect of this is the board also requested back in November that I convey to potential bidders the desire for the board of investigating service into Grand Rapids. And I believe, if memory serves me correctly, that all 4 bidders have addressed that in some way in their proposal. So depending on how we evaluate that and the importance of that, that gives us a place to kind of, you know, assign some points on that, how they address that or how they're approaching that. Then a couple customer service things, and these maybe could be lumped together, but we kind of see them differently. And one is, how does customer service work when a passenger's flight is canceled, delayed, rebooked, they need to make a change? That's an area that traditionally the industry does not get very high marks. They really look at it as a revenue source of, oh, sorry, we're going to charge you lots and lots of money to make your changes. So we're really curious as to how each carrier, what their policies are in that, because my experience is that's a really good way of ticking off a lot of passengers when something happens and then you're trying, that's not their fault, and then you're trying to get a lot of money out of them to make it better.
Barry, when you're talking about that, you're only talking about probably from here to Chicago versus Chicago and on, or something like that, I presume.
So, and off the side of the screen are some notes that I'm not showing you right now.
Okay.
One of the notes that we have there is it possible, let's say we've got a cancellation here because of weather, but flights are going out of Traverse City. And let's say the airline has an agreement with United or American. Are we able to basically, at no cost to that passenger, rebook them out of Traverse City so that they can just hop up there, get on a flight while we're shut down because of weather?
Okay.
It all fits into that. And those would be things that I think would be desirable and potentially are available that we've never had the luxury of being able to do.
Correct. Correct.
And then just a general, more customer service oriented, and things that I think can fall into this is, do they employ their own people, or do they contract out gate and helping of things in, let's say, Chicago, or even here? I mean, how does that work? Under the assumption that if they're your own employees, you're probably going to get a little bit better service than if it's just a subcontractor who's servicing 5 other airlines. That's something there. Just general, what is their reputation? Looking at other airports that they serve, what is their view? Do they provide good overall customer service? So those are kind of the 11 criteria. I'm throwing this out there to the board of, if there are things on there that you want to remove and don't think it's necessary for us to score by, if there are things that are missing that you'd like to add. This is your selection process. This is a tool that I'm putting together to help you in the process. I want to make sure that the tool encompasses all the things that you
Yes.
Barry, you've already developed a lot of criteria, it looks like. It's done some good legwork. That's great. That's good.
Got a
I
meeting.
think that's really important. I had one thing on those opportunities that I think you sent to us. It had a lot of small communities, basically in Michigan primarily, that do not have any kind of air service unless they go to like Traverse City or something like that. I don't know if there's that much opportunity to expand to some other smaller communities by one of those possible air services. I don't know, but I just happened to notice that in one of them. I don't remember which one it was, but it like 10 or 12 little communities that it services. So yeah, just a comment.
Okay. Are there any other comments on this?
Barry, okay, there's the rest of the stuff. I see you flash it up there now. You've got a tremendous amount of stuff there to help on the selection. If we get 80% of that completed, we're going to have a well thought out selection for an aircraft. So what would you like us to do next on this, Barry?
Well, what I would recommend is I will send this around to the board after this meeting.
Okay.
And I can incorporate any changes if you want. Otherwise, I'll send it as is. You look at it over the next week. And again, I am recommending that for our meeting next week that we start with a half hour where it's just us. That'll give us a time to figure out if, after we've all looked at this, if there are changes we want to make, we can make them day of, and get into the meeting. So we to look, review, and make changes. And this is just a tool. So
Right.
process, if it's not working well, we can change it. It's just, we used something very similar to this 2 years ago, and I think it worked well. Mark's been talking about it. So we kind of dusted it off and updated it for this time period.
Barry, I'm just thinking that if we wait until next Monday to do a review of this, it's going to be kind of late.
I agree.
Would you like us to perhaps by Thursday, if we got any suggested changes or some comments on it, to email you back?
People can email me any changes.
Okay.
It's still adhering to Open Meetings Act. We as a board, or you as a board, can't decide things outside of the meeting that you're going to want to do. So
Okay.
I can gather that information. You still need to be in a meeting to act on it.
Okay. Well, I would just say to everybody, if you want to just pass it on to Barry, then it'll be there for him to put out in front of us for our next meeting next Monday to look at it and decide to act on it or not to act on it or continue with what's already presented to us.
That makes good sense.
Okay, let's do that.
One,
This is very detailed. This, as I said a minute ago, if we get 80% of this pulled together, we're gonna have a good selection process.
one other thing that I want to throw out there, kind of a last item on this topic, is I'm planning on putting together
All right, okay, I'll be back here Friday. All right.
that I'm going to email to all 4 carriers that I'm basically going to request that they provide written responses. So here's an example of a question I want to ask. And just so we don't need to take up time in the presentation asking the same questions over and over when we can get that taken care of. But here's an example of a question. In all of the bid proposals, they each have a figure in there called average fare. Some of them say average net fare. Some of them just say average fare. I want to make sure that they explain what that number is. I believe, in my experience working on these things, is that it is a net fare in all cases, even though the wording is vague. And it's not the average fare that the customer pays.
All the 4 staff are coming back, have back
There's
contact.
probably-
So their supervisors let them know, and now their letters
Getting
are.
cut out, Barry.
Thank you.
Got some interference here.
I'm-
Are we all set?
I just muted Karen, so.
Oh, okay, okay. Goodbye, Karen.
Well, she can still hear us, but
Oh, okay, okay.
we're not hearing her until she wants us to be heard. So that's an example of a question. I want it to be clear what that number means. There are a couple other things that I have read through them. And another example is marketing spend. It ranges from like 20,000 to 50,000+. Are they all talking about the same type of, expenditure, or because that range signifies a pretty big range, but it may not be as wide once they explain what that number means.
Correct.
Get some of that stuff out of the way.
That's a really valuable criterion right there, and it should be consistent in terms of understanding for all 4 of those.
So are there, to the extent that you have read these, are there any things that you observed in reading them that you think should be on this list of questions, where you were confused by, I didn't understand what that meant across them, or they seem to be wording things differently and they might be the same or might not?
Barry, this is Andrew. I don't know that it needs to be in the criteria. I just wanted your feedback since you do deal with this a lot more. The boutique air proposal didn't seem that much different than their proposal 2 years ago from a formatting and information standpoint. And the fact that their last new edition was in 2018, is that of concern that it just seemed like a dated proposal?
It was clear that it was more kind of a standard proposal, that they didn't put a lot of time into massaging. But what I can say about them is I spent about an hour on the phone with them. So I did have a good conversation with their CEO. And they will be the new carrier in Ironwood, Michigan, going into O'Hare, probably just a few months before our route would start. So there are things on that with regards to them that basically make them much more viable than they were 2 years ago, because they will be operating in Chicago. And in some ways, I think they have the most aggressive as far as number of flights and number of seats that they would be flying in their proposal. maybe even to the point that we get more seats in the winter than we need. But that is the one thing that they did actually spend some time looking at is they actually, the proposal they had 2 years ago basically was just, I don't know what the number was, but I think it was just 3 flights a day year round, not at all addressing seasonality. Their proposal this time does have an off season, a shoulder season, and a peak season, directly responding to the conversation I had with their CEO prior to the meeting. They did some, but yes, most of it is just boilerplate that they put together on standard things. I think because of that, we've got more questions to ask them on during their presentation. Did that answer your questions, Andrew?
Yeah, and I wish they would have updated about what you just said about having that airport. That just, to me, when I read it, I was a little disappointed. It just seemed like a very dated proposal, like they didn't put a lot of effort into it.
Well, in kind of thinking from their perspective, they haven't officially been awarded Ironwood yet. It's kind of, the community has selected it. You know, they're waiting for DOT to formally, so I don't think they could reference that because it's not official. Although, given everything I know, there's no reason DOT would deny Ironwood's request in that scenario.
And I guess on their proposal, they mentioned that they have interlines with United and American based off SkyWest backing out because United didn't want to co-chair with them. Is that going to be an issue with any of these other agreements?
The difference there is the difference between a code share and an interline. Interline is more generic. Code share is much tighter. What SkyWest was looking at was code share. So therefore, I don't think that would impact them, but getting an understanding of how code share versus interline for United or American or other carriers, those are the types of things I think we want to drill into as we're talking to them.
I would tend to agree on that. Makes sense.
Yes, it does.
Yes. Okay, any other comments? Thank you, Barry. This is, as I said, is quite a outline you've prepared for us already.
Barry, you're going to be sending this out to all of us, is that right? By what, tomorrow or something, or?
Since I heard no changes, I can send it out immediately after this meeting.
Okay.
Does anybody have any changes? I'm just asking that for those of us sitting there and looking at this. I've got no changes. I would be very happy to have Barry send it out to us as is, and we'll go from there.
Okay, so this is going to be emailed to everyone, or how is it going to be submitted?
I will email it immediately after the meeting.
Okay.
Oh, great. Thank you.
Barry, I believe that's kind of a wrap there on that subject for the moment. Correct?
Correct.
Okay. Okay. Been a long meeting here. Any comments?
A lot of covered.
What?
We covered a lot
I
today.
know it, I know it, I know it. Any comments by board members before we go ahead and close, adjourn?
I think Barry's really given us a good update, so that was good. It's a little scary about how the money's going to flow, but we'll find out, I guess.
That's right. It's all new territory for everybody, I believe.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Mr. Gentili was referring in pretty much detail to some of those proposals. I don't recall receiving those. Did those go out by email?
They did go up by
I don't either.
I will, so Barry, you don't have them,
I
and
don't
Mark,
believe so.
I'll make sure I resend to you.
I'll look in the disposal files too, see if they went there by mistake.
Okay. Any other comments? If not, I will say the meeting's adjourned.
Keep safe.
Okay, you guys too, and thank you for joining us today.
Welcome. Thanks for
Have a
hosting.
good one.